Good morning and welcome to today's program, the U.S.-Korea Alliance and the Economic Cooperation under President Donald Trump and Lee Jae Myung. My name is Ellen Kim. I'm the Director of Academic Programs here at KIEP. And with President Lee's election in June and his recent visit to Washington for his first Washington Oval Office summit meeting with the President Trump, U.S.-Korea relations are basically back on track. But as many of us know, that there's a lot of a wide range of issues on the table that both sides need to address. And there's a lot of new developments taking place. And we saw last week Kim Jong-un's visit to Beijing and meeting with the Russian and Chinese leaders. And also we had this Hyundai factory raid that is actually creating a lot of issues between the two countries. So to help us think through where the U.S.-RK relationship stands today, I'm joined today by the two top Korea experts in town. Before I introduce them in a minute, let me just say that the research and analysis they present today will appear in the Korea Policy, the next issue of Korea Policy, KI's flagship academic journal, and the Korea Policy will be out in November and will be available in our website, so please stay tuned. Our two distinguished speakers on stage do not really need introduction because everybody knows them, but I'm gonna just briefly introduce both of you. On my left, Bruce Cleaner is a senior fellow at the Mansfield Foundation, specializing in Korean and Japanese affairs for more than 3 decades. From 2007 through 2025, he served as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And before that, he served for 20 years with the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency. Troy Stangaron is a non-resident fellow with the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology. He is a well-known specialist in economic and foreign policy relations on the Korean Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific region. Previously, he was a director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy and the deputy director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. And the most importantly, prior to that Wilson Center experience, he was the senior director and fellow at the KEI. So welcome back. So thank you both, Bruce and Troy, for joining us today. I will give you 5 to 8 minutes for your initial presentation on your assessment about the current U.S.-RK relations and some of the major issues between the two countries. So Bruce, would you like to start first?
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And I'll just sort of start by saying if I sound a little loopy today, it's because I landed at 1 a.m. this morning at National Airport after 10 days in the Caribbean. So maybe, I'm operating on very little sleep, maybe a residual rum hangover, maybe even nitrogen narcosis from, 7 or so scuba dives. So anyway, but it is a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to focus on the alliance, and what I've talked about in the paper is divergent priorities in dangerous times, and that the alliance right now faces a very uncertain future. Right now, the alliance and the overall partnership is challenged by the uncertainty of both nations' Indo-Pacific policies, competing national objectives, and Trump's willingness to risk long-standing alliances in favor of transactional economic gains. And while the alliance has weathered previous crises, the bilateral relationship may be facing its greatest challenge now. Now, old-timers may disagree over what crisis in the past was more, caused more uncertainty, but I think we are in very dangerous times right now. First, looking at South Korea, the election of Lee Jae Myung brought an end to the uncertainty wrought by President Yoon's impeachment. But we're still uncertain really what the Indo-Pacific policies or the foreign policies of the Lee administration will be. He positioned himself as a centrist conservative during the election. He abandoned many of his very critical comments of Japan and the United States and very conciliatory policies towards China and North Korea of the past. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty or even skepticism about what the future policies will be. Now, since he's been elected, he's maintained a very centrist views, the very laudatory of the U.S. alliance, the relationship with Japan, the need for bilateral and trilateral security coordination, and has been, in my view, very reasonable in his depictions of South Korea's outreach to both North Korea and China. And I think the president needs to be commended for a very successful summit, although right now the metric for a successful summit is that he was not Zelensky'd during his meeting with Trump. I think he very adroitly sort of deflected any potential crises. There are conflicting or competing factions within the Yi administration on foreign policy. We have Lee Sung-lok, the National Security Advisor. We're very well known to Korea hands, very traditional, very pragmatic foreign policy. On the other hand, Chung Dong-young, the Minister of Unification, is much more sunshine policy, which in my view was, overly extensive benefits to North Korea without demands for reciprocal actions by Pyongyang. The U.S. policy also is very undefined. There have been sort of surprisingly traditional statements by the administration on Indo-Pacific policy, but really I think there's sort of four camps determining or competing on what Trump policy towards Indo-Pacific will be. The traditional hawks have been weakened by the firing of Michael Walls, the National Security Advisor, the gutting of the Asia Directorate of the National Security Council, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio is much more muted in his comments than during his time in the Senate. The two main, I think, competing factions are the prioritizers and the constrainers, restrainers, neo-isolationists. The prioritizers sort of have a Taiwan is the only issue that the U.S. should be focused on overseas, foreign and security policies. But in some private comments, I think even some of the prioritizers are sheep in wolf's clothing, in that they tend to be even more isolationist than they are prioritizers. The prioritizers are more America first. Why are we getting involved in any issues overseas? Why should we allow any partner or ally to drag us into an overseas conflict? And then the fourth group I'd call the fiscal hawks, which I would see Trump as, where it's more talking about economic tools, economic punishment to coerce other nations to conform to U.S. objectives. But even that is Trump's overall focus is on making a deal eventually with Xi Jinping. And as we see that after having browbeaten South Korea into disadvantageous trade deal with South Korea, the U.S. is now making demands on security. And we've seen that sort of on the transactional economic aspect of the security deal, which is both pushing South Korea to spend more of its GDP, or more of its government funding towards defense as measured in GDP, and also perhaps will be making a demand on a greater dispensation to the U.S. for the cost of U.S. forces stationed there, maybe renegotiating the special measures agreement deal. Also, the reorienting or modernizing the alliance, where we see it as reorienting the main focus of U.S. forces Korea towards the China or Taiwan contingencies, perhaps reducing U.S. forces there, and then also seeking South Korea to assume a larger responsibility, not only for its defense against North Korea, but also assuming a larger role in the region and maybe perhaps some public announcement of its support for or even involvement in U.S. operations or contingencies against Taiwan. Other demands may be, or issues on the security, is that Trump will be much more amenable to President Yi's request for reducing or abandoning or canceling bilateral military exercises. Trump did that unilaterally in his first term. He got nothing in return from North Korea. It was just, he thought the exercises were silly war games by the generals and that they were too expensive. OPCON transition is another issue where South Korea may be pushing on an open door. Trump could be much more open to that, even if South Korea has not yet met the conditions of the previous conditions-based transition plan. On North Korea, the U.S. and South Korea are stymied on their outreach. Pyongyang doesn't seem interested in talking with either country, and North Korea has even rejected letters from Trump to Kim Jong-un. The concern I have mostly with North Korea is that Trump might be amenable to a North Korean outreach for a peace agreement or a peace declaration. North Korea could appeal to Trump's ego and say this would be something that no president has been able to do to solve the Korean War Nobel Peace Prize theme music, et cetera. So he may be more open to that, which would create the illusion of reducing the North Korean threat, but without actually accomplishing anything. So I think what we see is that the U.S. needs allies in its strategic objective of trying to contain, constrain, compete with China, and yet in our demands on security issues, not only with Asia allies, but with NATO, as well as these tariff deals, that we're pushing away our allies. The analogy I think of is if you think of an old Wild West movie, when the sheriff is trying to cajole the nervous townspeople to go after the very scary villain down in Deadwood Gulch, but instead of urging them on, he sort of, first wounds them, and then he takes their wallets and say, come on, saddle up, we're going on a posse against the bad guys. And oh, by the way, I'm trying to make a deal with the bad guy at the same time. So I think as we see things moving forward, there's great uncertainty, great potential for tension in the alliance. And at the same time, though, South Korea does need to step up. It can't avoid some involvement in Taiwan contingencies as much as it would like to avoid any kind of comments that risk aggravating China. But it is a global nation. It needs to act like it, and it does need to realize that its strategic interests, both economic and strategic, would be highly impacted by a Taiwan contingency.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. Troy?
Thank you, and it's good to be back. I think first I want to start off briefly talking a little bit about the raid in Georgia. The good news is that today at noon, everyone is set to go home. I think when we look at this is sort of symptomatic of something that I talk about in the paper, but not in the immigration context per se, which is that we need to understand that this administration is different. It has different priorities, and it is going to approach things in an aggressive fashion. And so, as regrettable and unfortunate, I think that the Hyundai LG Energy Systems situation could have been handled much differently, and it probably would have been handled much differently by a different administration, that this is sort of where we are. So I'm glad to see people are going to be able to go home, but this is something we need to take as serious. And so, when we look about the U.S.-Korea relationship, I think the modern era of economic cooperation can really probably be started and marked off with the negotiation and implementation of the Chorus FTA. And if we look at cooperation going forward, it cut across administrations, both Obama, first Trump, and the Biden administration, and looked at things like supply chain security, clean energy, science and technology, cooperation on emerging technologies. And you see actually a lot of these things maintained. If you look at the Moon Jae-in summit statement with President Trump, it lists these areas as things that we're going to cooperate on. Now, the focus of the Trump administration in the first term was reducing the trade deficit, but it didn't necessarily eliminate cooperation on these other issues. This is a different administration. And when we look at what they prioritize, things like clean energy, some of the other issues that had been, like the first Trump administration actually added to the agenda, women's economic empowerment. I can't imagine that's going to be a priority for this administration. So we're at a different time, and we need to rethink how we approach things. And so this is the question of where we are. So if we look at this from a broader perspective, the focus has been on the tariffs. And so the part of the question is, what is the administration using? So one, we have what they've called the reciprocal tariffs, which were announced on Liberation Day, which use the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. That is in the courts right now. It is under question about its authority. But in essence, what the administration has done is they have utilized emergency authorities to declare that trade deficits and the impact trade has had on manufacturing is a national emergency. And so therefore, the president has the authority to put tariffs in place. Now, the reason this is being questioned is that, one, the statutes for IEEPA do not mention the word tariff. They do not mention any word Congress has ever used that relates to the word tariff. And so there is questions about whether the president actually has the authority to do this, given that this is a constitutional authority of Congress, not of the administration. So while Congress has delegated certain trade authorities to the administration, it has always been very clear. In Trade Promotion Authority, it laid out, for example, both how an administration could negotiate, what the negotiating objectives were, and for how long it would have authority to do so. So Congress has always been very stringent on what an administration could do in terms of trade. So if we think about the reciprocal tariffs, that's what everybody focuses on. It's sort of the big picture. It was the deadline that the Korean government and other governments faced in terms of cutting a deal with the Trump administration. But if we look at this from Korea's perspective, I think it's actually the Section 232, which are the national security tariffs, which are not legally being challenged, that is actually the bigger issue for Korea. If we look at South Korea's trade, roughly a third of exports are automobiles and auto parts. Automobile tariffs have been in place since April 2. They were done under the Section 232 process. And so regardless of whether the Supreme Court rules that the reciprocal tariffs are constitutional or not, those tariffs will remain in place. If we look at steel, it's the 5th largest export for Korea to the United States. Some of that has been slightly depressed by the Section 232 from the first Trump administration, which capped it at 70% of Korea's average of 3 years between 2015 and 2017. So it's been roughly static for that period. The Trump administration eliminated that cap that they had negotiated, and so it subjected Korea to the 50% Section 232 tariff that is now in place. And that, once again, will be there regardless. But what the Trump administration has done that is different is they are also placing tariffs and investigating in other Section 232s what are called derivative products. So this means things like washing machines, refrigerators that have steel content. Those now have an additional tariff on the steel, and we've seen a drop of about 20% in terms of exports of household goods to the United States from Korea. And at the same time, there's a Section 232 going on for semiconductors. Semiconductors are Korea's largest overall export. They're not the largest export to the United States. Only about 7% of Korean semiconductors goes to the US from Korea. And part of that's because, as we all know, with supply chains, you have a situation to where a lot of goods are produced overseas. The semiconductors are put into those goods and then shipped to the United States. So indirectly, there are a lot of Korean semiconductors going to the United States, but in terms of pure semiconductor exports, it's relatively small. The difficulty for this is, again, the derivative products. So things like computers, smartphones, all of these have semiconductors. All of these are potentially going to be tariffed once the Section 232 comes out. So given the impact this would have on Korea, that essentially its key industries are all under Section 232, South Korea had to cut a deal with the Trump administration. And it didn't matter regardless of the reciprocal tariffs. While the reciprocal tariffs obviously hurt other industries in Korea, the Section 232s, I think, are the real challenge for Korea. And so in essence, the Trump administration cut a deal that was framed along the lines of the deal Japan made. Once Japan reached its agreement with the Trump administration, you've seen quotes from the EU that they felt they quickly had to agree to a similar type of deal because this was basically now the template for the deals. So the Japan deal is the template, Korea's deal is a version of it. And in essence, what Korea agreed to is the key point is the $350 billion in investment in the United States. $150 billion of which would be in the shipbuilding industry. Specifically, it would cover new investments in shipbuilding. It would cover research, development, and transfers of technology to the United States. It would cover the improvement of U.S. supply chains in shipbuilding. And it would also do workforce training. And workforce training is part of the challenge that we've seen with the issue in Georgia, to where there isn't enough trained workers in the United States for a lot of these skills. It's not just Korean firms, other foreign firms have had to take and bring workers in. And so part of the challenge in making these plants functional and operational long-term is training up a US workforce. And so part of this money would go into that. So in terms of the broader context, in addition to the $350 billion in investment, Korea also agreed to buy, through the end of the Trump administration, essentially $100 billion in US energy products. In return, The reciprocal tariff was dropped to 15%. Korea was similar to Japan and EU, would get a 15% tariff on automobiles and auto parts. And Korea was guaranteed on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, in essence, most favored nation status, so that it wouldn't get any worse of a deal than anyone else was able to negotiate with the United States. On some of the other Section 232s, because there are a record number under the Trump administration, it's unclear whether Korea would also get most favored nation status, but on those sort of critical ones, it was able to secure that as part of its agreement. Now, we've seen, obviously, with the raid and comments from President Lee, that not only is the deal on investment not concluded, which we knew from the summit because there wasn't really any statements that came out, but that this is now an obstacle to finalizing that deal as well. And so that's sort of where we are in the current situation. The question then sort of becomes, where do we take and go? As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, I think we need to rethink the economic relationship. And so I think some of that means that both the US and Korea need to rethink how they engage on economic issues. So let's start with some of the basics. Some of this is because the US is determined to take and push more manufacturing to the United States. Korean firms, I think, need to rethink how they view the US and view it more as a production base. So one of the potential advantages for Korea with the Trump administration's policies is that if we look at least in Southeast Asia, which has historically been an area where Korea has looked to grow its presence, it's essentially negotiated for the United States the removal of tariffs for a lot of items. So I think it would behoove Korean companies to look at what they could produce in the US and send now to parts of Southeast Asia that have removed their tariffs. And so think of investments not just for serving the US market, but has an export platform to third markets as well. Two, within this same context, when Korean firms are thinking about investments, what parts of the supply chain can be moved here? Hyundai and Kia imported a lot of steel for their vehicles. The agreement they reached, or the pledge they made, just prior to the Liberation Day tariffs, was that they would invest $21 billion in the United States, about $7 billion of which will go into a steel plant in Louisiana, which will supply the Hyundai plant in Alabama. It will supply the West Point factory in Georgia, the Kia plant, and then it will supply the Meta plant for Hyundai and Kia vehicles in Savannah, Georgia. So what else can be efficiently brought to the United States that would take and put more of a supply chain in the US, and think about investments that way in terms of parts and supplies. Two, Korea obviously needs to think about diversifying its trade relationship. And this is something we've seen the Lee administration discuss joining CPTPP. I think they should. I've written about this before. There are also some new trade agreements that are emerging that are trying to center things around rules-based trade. I think it would behoove Korea to try and join those. The one that is out there, the Future Investment and Trade Partnership, is designed for essentially small and medium-sized economies. I'm not sure if the participating countries will still consider Korea a medium-sized economy. If they don't, I think it would behoove Korea to talk with other similar-sized economies about trying to take and build some kind of arrangement so that way you can diversify trade amongst each other as well. I would also suggest that, because there's been a lot of questions about, is the Chorus FTA still relevant? I think it is, but in ways that maybe others haven't considered. And I think it's important for Korea to keep it in place. When we think about the authorities Trump has used to put tariffs in place, these are all based on either national security or emergency authorities. Now, the precedent from the Biden administration is that a new administration is going to be unlikely to remove things. But I think some of these might be removed over time by next administration. And as long as Chorus is in place, that becomes the default for Korea, not whatever the US's tariffs are. So that puts Korea long-term potentially in a slightly better position than other countries by making sure Chorus stays in place. But there are also working groups that have been established through Chorus that I think are important to try and work through other tensions in the relationship going forward. And so I think the last thing I'd want to say before we open things up to questions is that we're in a new environment, and it's important that we take and look at that environment for what it is, not what we hope it will be. When President Trump first ran for office, the phrase became that, we should take him seriously, but not literally. I think over time, one of the challenges, if you see the way countries have reacted to the tariffs, the way Wall Street has reacted to the tariffs, the way others have, is that they forgot in the first part, which is you should take President Trump seriously. He has laid out his priorities. He has laid out how he's going to do them. The details may not ultimately be what he has said, but this is the new environment in which we are all working. And with that, thank you.
Thank you both for your excellent presentation. Bruce's presentation on the security diplomatic dimensions and Troy's talks on the trade and economy really capture a comprehensive view of where the alliance is and all the key issues on the table. Since both of you are all-rounder on the Korean affairs, I would like to take some opportunity to see whether you have any suggestions or thoughts or feedback you'd like to give to each other's presentation or analysis. Not trying to put you in a fight each other.
Bruce, you're totally wrong.
I had the chance to read Troy's paper, which will be published in November. So I have an advantage over the audience because he goes into a lot more detail than he was able to do here. A really excellent paper. I commend you to read it when it's published. Really a lot of details and comments and recommendations that he wasn't able to cover today. My one main quibble is that I don't think he was critical enough of the tariffs. Now, he doesn't tend to be as old and curmudgeon-y as I am, so I'm a bit more critical on, I think, some of the aspects. So when he talks about reshaping the international trading order, I see it as it's not just doing it for some sort of esoteric reason, but it's really to make it to the U.S. advantage. So it's really Donald Corleone's tariff extortion racket. And he's trying to recreate really the tributary economic system of imperial China so that it all benefits the U.S., countries bringing gifts, companies bringing investment promises in order not to be punished. And that he did point out that the tariffs are actively hostile to certain economic activity and created policy uncertainty. I'd go further and say it's really the U.S. is conducting economic warfare not only against China, but even its partners and allies. And right now, South Korea and others see themselves caught between two abusive economic partners, with the U.S. being the more direct, immediate threat. We're taking action against their economies, their trade, whereas the China threat tends to be more, yes, they could do another THAAD retaliatory policy or not, but right now the wolf closest to the sled is the U.S. And the countries may see little difference between, being subject to the Corleone or the Tattaglia families. And when Troy pointed out in the paper that Trump's skepticism of trade deals goes back to the 1980s, and I think it was a 1987 op-ed that he commissioned in many newspapers, which really talked about we're being taken advantage of, we're being laughed at, et cetera. So really, a lot of the policies are based on sort of long-standing prejudices and current whims. And the whims is we've seen, if a country criticizes the U.S., well, then the tariffs go higher. We've also seen that the tariffs are not reciprocal. They're not in response to other countries' tariffs. They're due to the U.S. trade deficit with that country that people have shown to be the case. And there are a number of inaccuracies that Trump has made about the South Korean tariffs. In essence, they're 0% or 0.79% because of the KORUS FTA, and yet Trump has said it's 14% tariffs. And then also in his Rose Garden presentation, it said 50% of South Korean tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So a lot of incorrect data, a lot of incorrect assumptions and long-standing prejudices. Troy pointed out in the paper that Trump criticized the KORUS FTA as a jobs-killing deal, but then when he did sort of a minimalist renegotiation of it, he then praised it as a wonderful tariff. It was a wonderful deal. It was great. So now he's going against the deal that he renegotiated. So the tariffs are in violation of KORUS, as well as the U.S., Korea, Mexico agreement. as well as a bilateral personal agreement of 2019 between Trump and then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Another quibble is when people depict that the trade deal that Korea has with the U.S. lowered the tariffs from 25 to 15%. I see it as more, no, they raised it from 0% to 15%. If you think of what the rates were at the beginning of the year, so even though it was raised to an exorbitant level and then reduced to a slightly less exorbitant level, it's still a major increase from where we were at the beginning of the year. Now, as Troy pointed out, the big part of this deal is the $350 billion investment promise. But Trump and others have also said that the profits or some of the profits will be controlled or given to the U.S. government, which doesn't conform with any definition of capitalism. And I think another major point that needs to be made is that the foreign countries and the foreign businesses don't pay the tariffs. They are absorbed by the U.S. importing business, which either then eats the additional cost or passes them on to consumers. So tariffs are taxes on the American consumer and businesses. And that it's perhaps the largest tax increase in U.S. history. So anytime you see tariffs, think taxes. So when Trump talks about however many hundreds of billions of dollars are coming into the U.S. Treasury coffers, it's being paid for by the U.S. consumers and businesses. A question I have on, if the push is to bring foreign firms into the U.S. to manufacture, even though there's some of these steel production will now be in the U.S., which will take some time to come into place, will these foreign firms have to pay their very high tariffs on steel and aluminum and other intermediate goods like computer chips, et cetera? U.S. firms, particularly the car manufacturers, have said they are now more disadvantaged after the tariffs than they were before, because the foreign car manufacturers are only going to pay a 15% tariff on the goods coming into the U.S., where now the U.S. car manufacturers are going to be paying 50% tariff on steel and aluminum and other components. So a number of the U.S. auto manufacturers have complained that they're now worse off than they were before the tariffs. A very good point that Troy made in the paper is that the current agreement is the beginning of the process rather than the end. And since Trump was willing to violate KORUS, which has the force of a treaty because it was passed by Congress, as well as the other agreements with Canada, Mexico, et cetera, why would anyone believe that he'll abide by what is an executive agreement with these countries on these trade deals? So foreign manufacturers, are they going to make the decision for a very lengthy process, very expensive process of building manufacturing plants in the U.S. if they don't know if the tariffs may change tomorrow? And so what I finally say is that by adopting this mercantilist approach to economic trade with other countries, sort of a U.S. Uber alles, we are calling into question the veracity of U.S. trade promises and even security promises. Countries are now questioning the U.S. commitment to trade with the other countries as well as their security commitments. And finally, I think Trump's over-reliance on tariffs for not only economic but also non-economic policies. He imposed 50% tariff on Brazil because of impeachment or court cases against the former president. We've seen it with other things where it had nothing to do with economics. So Trump with tariffs is kind of like a toddler with a hammer, where everything looks like a nail, and it results in great destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you for the kind words about the paper and everything. Maybe I'll start off talking a little bit about some of your comments, and then I'll say a couple words about yours as well. So we'll just start with what you ended with, Trump using tariffs for non-economic purposes. I've kind of looked into this. I haven't had a chance to finish writing something on this. You see a little bit of this going back into even the first administration. So this is a pattern that carries forward. But I think this is sort of why the Supreme Court case is actually very, very important. I don't know if the Supreme Court actually understands how important this case is, because in essence, if they validate what Trump has claimed as his authority under IEPA, that means he has unlimited authority to set tariff rates for any reason he wants, because he merely has to declare a national emergency. So if, for example, I was reading on my way in a story about how there's a lot of debate. Well, we saw Vice President Vance talk about questions about freedom of speech in Europe. But there's a debate in the UK because of some recent arrests over whether they've gone too far to restrict free speech. If Trump decides that he doesn't like speech in the United Kingdom and that they need to change their laws, he can simply declare a national emergency and say, I'm tariffing the United Kingdom for this. I think it's unlikely in the UK's case because he seems to like hanging out with the royal family, and so the UK has gotten better deals. But if there is some policy abroad that the United States determines they do not like, they can simply take and put a tariff in place. And this is why, one of the things that I talk about in the paper is that, traditionally, this is an op-ed I wrote, apologies. But the US would use economic pressure and things to lean on partners before. That in itself is not new. But it was done where vital US security interests were usually at stake. So things like Huawei in the first Trump administration, I think, would be a good example, to keep it in the Trumpian context, if you will. But at the same time, we might complain to countries about things that were generally viewed as the internal domestic policy rights of a country, but we wouldn't necessarily take and try to put in place sanctions or something else. And so, diplomacy would be used, trying to get countries to change, their laws and things. But so what we've seen under the Trump administration is they don't like digital taxes. So any country that puts in place a digital tax, they have threatened or put in place tariffs in response to. The Biden administration allowed India, I think somewhat begrudgingly, to import Russian oil, but they didn't want to see a crisis on international markets by having all Russian oil come off the market. So as long as India bought it at below market prices, we were okay with that. The Trump administration has decided to sanction India. Not just, you got the 25% reciprocal tariff, but then you have this new 25% tariff because of the oil itself. In Brazil, you have the Bolsonaro coup hearing, and because Trump empathizes with Bolsonaro, and because they don't like this going on, and Bolsonaro's son has lobbied the Trump administration, Brazil now faces an additional 25% tariff because of that. And in the Korean context, one of the things that I've tried to make clear to my colleagues is that while there's a lot of interest in what's called the online platform legislation to regulate online platforms, this is something that multiple Trump administration officials, either from the first administration or the current one, have written about their disdain for. And so, one thing I've tried to emphasize is that you should not assume that if this legislation goes forward and is passed, that the Trump administration will simply not place an additional tariff on Korea to try and force you to change this. And so this is why I think it's important, this case before the Supreme Court, because never before has a US president either considered or had the ability to really take and just simply decide, I don't like what you're doing. I am going to take and put a significant tariff on you to take and try to force you to change your policy. And given that our Constitution, one, places not that necessarily this is war in the traditional sense, the ability to declare war within Congress, it gives the ability to place tariffs within Congress. This would be a significant shift in basically the constitutional structure in the United States. So beyond that, you had also talked about, I agree, tariffs are a tax. I mean, all you have to do is go back to the United States. I mean, that literally was how the federal government taxed goods, so that way it could gain revenue. So this shouldn't be a question that tariffs are taxes. I mean, that's literally the founding of the United States. On your question about intermediate goods and, will Korean firms have to pay them? There's some uncertainty on this because the trade deal actually isn't really finalized. Japan was able to secure basically an agreement that it would not face stacked tariffs. So if you're already paying the auto tariff, you don't then pay a tariff on steel. I haven't seen anything definitive on whether Korea was able to secure the same thing, that, basically you only pay the primary tariff, you don't pay a tax tariff for these sort of ancillary tariffs. And so I think that's an important, question going forward on where we sort of are on that. And then, sorry, I should have written it down. There was something you had said early on as well, but if it comes to me, I will touch on that. I really enjoyed reading your paper. I think it does a great job of laying everything out as well, and I would commend it to everyone when it comes out. The one thing that I hope maybe you can get into a bit more here today and put in the paper is you briefly talk about how President Lee has, sort of changed his tune on Japan, has sort of said the right thing about trilateralism. And you talk about in the paper sort of that the Indo-Pacific policies are not really fleshed out. But you don't actually really talk about, one, whether you think the Trump administration will continue to pursue trilateralism with Korea and Japan, and sort of what it might look like under what will now actually be, a new administration in Korea, a new administration in Japan, and the Trump administration. And I'd also, this is more for maybe our discussion today, and because you have also, a Japan background as well, your thoughts on sort of who might be the next Japanese prime minister now that Ishiba is resigning, and sort of what that might mean for trilateralism, because even if, Korea and the US are willing to go forward, could this, now the new administration in Japan, put the brakes on it?
Really nice. I don't have you guys all did my homework for each of your paper,
Well,
so
there is one thing we talked about beforehand that I can touch on later, but I'll defer to Bruce. Yeah.
Well, on the trilateralism, I was thinking of including that, but I was already, my draft was far above the word limit, and I was tossing things out left and right. I was, actually deleting about 2,000 words as it was. So we saw in the first term that Trump didn't really care about the trilateralism, whereas the Obama and Biden administrations had a lot of behind-the-scenes action to cajole Japan and Korea towards improving their relations. And the U.S. could take some credit for the Comfort Women Agreement. But during the first term, some Trump officials privately said, yeah, it's their problem. They have to repair their relations. It's not on us. So I don't think there will be that focus of trying to improve their relations, except in the context of, even when we see the supportive comments or the affirmative comments of Trump officials towards the two alliances with Japan and Korea, cornerstone linchpin, ironclad commitment, the underlying context is, to support them as they support our policies against China. So as we have this security coalition working against China, particularly Taiwan contingencies, so it's sort of you two countries and others need to be on board with our overarching objectives, focusing on China, the prioritizer argument. And I don't think there's more beyond that. So it really is, we don't see the shoulder to shoulder, we will, fight with you on the beaches against the North Korean attack. You don't really, when I laid out the different camps within the Trump administration, the one I don't see is sort of the alliance hawks. Except I hear that in Congress, but I don't hear it in the administration of shoulder to shoulder, kapchita, you fought with us in every war since the Korean War, we were with you then, we were with you now. I don't hear that. It's more of a, we'll support you as you support us against China.
We have about 15 minutes, so I am going to skip my part and then go straight into a Q&A session. So there's going to be a microphone running, so let's see. Okay, James, would you like to, do you have a question for the presenters?
Thank you. Look forward to reading the book first.
Please identify yourself before.
James Tim from KEI. So I think Bruce laid out some interesting questions, which I would like to ask Troy and then also ask Bruce. I think that it's fairly clear from everyone in town and people in Seoul that, yes, the Trump administration is a bit unpredictable. But I would like to ask Troy, from an economic standpoint, do you see Korea any more disadvantaged in the economic relations with the US compared to other countries? And as Bruce pointed out, what the Trump administration is doing on on tariff, on trade, for instance, is actually negatively affecting even American companies. That could potentially be a good thing if it's more disadvantageous for the American companies. Also, what it's doing is, you might argue, and I'm just taking a contrarian view, that the tariff against China and Chinese products coming into the United States provides an opening and opportunity for Korean companies to also perform. Are we seeing lessening of economic cooperation and trade? Based on the trade data from Korea, it seems to me year over year, monthly trade exports is fairly stable. So has the tariff kicked in, or are we gonna get this later on in the year? Or is this, are we still, in other words, can we embrace uncertainty and risk and see opportunities in them on the economic side? And what are the kinds of conditions that would be necessary in order for South Korea to not end up with the shorter end of the stick? For Bruce, I think the alliance question is a different matter, right? Because as you pointed out, looking at how different allies in the region have responded to US strategic interests in the region, South Korea's, not this particular administration, we're not clear on what this administration is because it's only been about 100 days now for Lee Jae Myung. But previous administration has been somewhat cautious on some of these issues related to China, for instance. And in that case, do we have more to lose on the alliance side than, let's say, US-Japan? Or is this uncertainty creating areas and pockets of opportunities on regional cooperation emerging, a different kind of regional cooperation, perhaps with Korea and Japan, or Korea with other countries like Australia, for instance? President Lee Jae Myung just recently had a press conference where he seemed to say that he's going to take a two-track approach on history matters and relations with Japan. Agree on areas where they can agree, and disagree and deal with the issues where they disagree.
Who would like to go first?
I
Yeah.
didn't know if you were collecting them.
On the question, is Korea disadvantaged? I think it's a relativistic question in the sense of that there are certain areas where that potentially is. So if we look at autos, one of the complaints you see out of Korea, and now I think given the reality of where we are, Korea got the best deal it could, but it went from having a zero tariff into the United States on automobiles with Japan and the EU facing a 2.5% tariff to now all three having a 15% tariff. So even if some of the US automakers, depending on certain production, are more disadvantaged than Korea, Korea is disadvantaged relative to the European Union and Japan based on where things, at least right now, have ended up. And there's other parts of this too. So the Kia Forte that's sold in the US market is only made in Mexico. And so because the auto tariffs have been on place in Mexico as well, the USMCA compliant did not apply to autos. Even when Korea gets the lower tariff, Kia's production of the Forte is going to be disadvantaged relative to other vehicles in Korea. Now, are there opportunities within these sort of divergent agreements? And James, you had mentioned China. This is one of the things that I think from a competitive standpoint has been one of the areas where Korea has had an advantage on the EV battery side. the Chinese built out their EV battery industry by providing subsidies, but not making Korean and Japanese firms, which at the time were more competitive than Chinese firms, eligible for the batteries. It grew out the Chinese battery company CATL and the others that we know today. But because of the way the Inflation Reduction Act worked and now the tariffs on China, that has essentially left the space in the United States open to Korea, who is more competitive on the whole than Panasonic from Japan, to really build out and become a competitive player in the industry. The difficulty is the Trump administration is against a lot of these policies. And we talk about the tariffs, but one of the things that I've noticed is if you look at the Trump administration, in essence, there was a bargain that they put in place or in the campaign. We're going to put high tariffs in place, but we're going to cut taxes and we're going to cut regulations to make the U.S. the most competitive domestic market in the world. And so that's going to be why you're going to want to invest here. You'll still make money, it'll still be good, you just have to build it here. That hasn't applied across all industries. So if you are invested in wind or solar, the Secretary of Energy's department now has to take and basically approve any project going forward, which has made it very difficult to build in those industries. Now, you might say, okay, that's not EV batteries, and that's fair, but Hanwha Q-Cells has invested a lot of money in the state of Georgia to try and build eventually what would be a US-only supply chain for solar panels. And so you have a Korean company who's trying to do what the administration in theory wants, which is produce in the United States, only supply from the United States, reduce dependency on China, but at the same time, they're making it really hard for them to do business in the United States. And so I think some of this, James, will depend on what the industry is. Some of this will depend on what the country you're competing with is. And so yes, there will be areas to where there are advantages, but there's also going to be areas where there are disadvantages. And so it's going to be very relative depending on the product and the country. Have the tariffs kicked in? In August, both automobile and steel exports were down. So I think we're starting to see that kick in. And then how does Korea avoid getting the short end of the stick? I think there's a couple things Korea needs to do. One of the things that has been clear over the last few days as a result of the raid in Georgia is that Korea is not comfortable with accepting the deal that Japan did on the MOU. There are specific reasons why. Some of them get into, and the Korean government has sort of hinted at this, the different positions in terms of foreign exchange reserves and the role of the Korean won versus the Japanese yen in international financial markets in terms of what Korea can do. But it would be very disruptive for Korea to accept a deal to where, in essence, it was providing $100 billion roughly in cash a year to the United States for investments. And if you look at it in terms of how this is going to be structured, that I think is going to be one of the key selling points. But also, Bruce mentioned I think you mentioned the share of the division in terms of profits eventually. Yeah, I think Korea understandably doesn't want something as a disadvantage, so that hasn't been said publicly. At the same time, if you read through the details of the MOU, the Japanese are trying to put a good face on it that, well, we don't have to accept a proposal, and we have this consultative committee which will make recommendations to the other committee, which is going to make recommendations to the president. But basically, the Japanese ability to control the investments is so far removed. And there's a quote in the New York Times from a former METI official today about how Japan is not an ATM for the United States, and that basically this agreement won't work the way the Trump administration thinks. I think that is actually not an understanding of the circumstance. By actually agreeing that the Trump administration, whenever it wants, can reimpose whatever tariff it wants. And given the way the Japanese have approached this negotiation, I think the Trump administration is going to be very incentivized to put a tariff in place if Japan says no to an investment it wants. And so then the Japanese will have to move forward with that investment. And so I assume this hasn't been in any of the Korean public comments, but that Korea wants to avoid getting into that same type of situation. And it'll be interesting to see if whoever Ishiba's successor is takes and actually accepts this MOU or tries to renegotiate, because I wonder if there's going to be some political pushback and everything in Japan. But I think, so to avoid the short of the stick, you need to get a better end of the deal, but you also, I think Korea and Korean firms need to move quickly as things change. There has been a lot of movement by Chinese companies into third country markets knowing they're not going to have access to the US market. I think Korea and Korean firms need to be moving as quickly as the Chinese are to try and take, and not just in the United States, see where there are advantages or disadvantages, but also in third country markets, because basically with the Trump administration doing this to everyone, that means you're going to be competing not just with the Chinese and other markets, but with the Japanese, with the Europeans, with the Canadians, with others. And so I think Korea has to be very quick and flexible in what they do.
On the bilateral Korea-Japan relationship, I think the Lee administration and President Lee himself has said all the right things about the importance of that because of the facing common security threats in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the need to collaborate with each other as well as other nations to sort of diversify away from China economically. And I think the Lee administration should be commended for that. In the past, Lee and the Democratic Party and other opposition parties, or now ruling parties, have said very critical things of Japan. They even equated President Yoon Suk-yeol's outreach to Japan as traitorous and the worst moment in South Korean diplomatic history, et cetera. So I hope the administration doesn't backslide into those previous views towards Japan. I don't think the Lee administration is going to undo the forced labor agreement as Moon Jae-in undid the Comfort Women agreement, but I think the DP has a far lower bar for being offended by some Japanese statement or action. So even though, as other administrations have said, they sort of have two tracks, deal with history while moving forward, I think all it will take is some Japanese official comment or action that the Democratic Party of Korea is going to respond much more strongly, much more forcibly than the PPP would have. In his paper, Troy commented that Korea could or should diversify its trade away from both China and the U.S. On security, it's harder to do that. South Korea is so reliant on the U.S. for its defense against North Korea, its deterrence against North Korea, even though the South Korean military is very strong and has done a lot of commendable things in the last 10 years particularly. It really can't do it alone, particularly considering North Korea's nuclear weapons. So it can't really create an Asian NATO without the U.S. involvement because of the history issues with Japan as well as other issues. So it really continues to be very reliant on the United States for its security, and yet right now it's questioning the U.S. commitment to Korea's defense. Trump has talked, literally tried to make a profit off of our sons and daughters in uniform during the first term special measures agreement, has seemed much more open to removing or reducing U.S. forces there, reorienting them elsewhere. So South Korea is very nervous about whether the U.S. will live up to its treaty commitments.
We have about 2 minutes, so I would like to take some questions. Lady in front, and then we'll just collect the questions, so make the question really quick.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for putting this up, and it's wonderful. My name is Olivia Kim. I'm a research fellow at KIEP, and I have a question for Troy specifically because you started your presentation by mentioning Georgia raid, and they're finally going back home, and it took a week, and Trump and Korea just had summits, and then over $300 billion investment pledge and everything, right? The Trump obviously wants the foreign investment to the United States, but how does this immigration incident, how does this raid gonna affect South Korea's investment, or how is it gonna change the U.S. Policy on investment and immigration? Because it clearly shows some intersection between immigration policy and investment policy. Thank you.
The gentleman over at the back.
Hi, my name is Terrence Matsuo. I'm a non-resident fellow here at KEI. It's always great to hear from Troy and Bruce, so thank you for your comments. Really quickly, I think South Korean progressives tend to not be as keen on nuclear weapons, but as I think Bruce has mentioned, we don't have any alliance hawks, I believe you said, in this administration. And so given the Trump administration's kind of coolness to getting involved overseas and living up to our treaty commitments, kind of what do you expect to see in South Korea regarding, the creation of an indigenous nuclear weapons program and nuclear nonproliferation more generally? Thank you.
There's a big bomb question for you.
So how does the raid impact investment, and then how does it impact the U.S. Side of things? So we have seen so far, Hyundai and LG Energy Systems have stopped construction on the plant in Savannah, Georgia. 22 other Korean investments in the United States have either stopped or paused work on their construction. And LG Energy Systems has brought all of their people, in essence, in the U.S. home from all facilities. So the immediate impact, I think, is very stark, in that it's basically put a pause on Korean investment in the United States. And I think without some type of resolution to this, it's going to make it very difficult for Korea to do investment, because they're going to need to find a way to bring in workers who can take and set up certain types of equipment, and also take and train American workers on how to use that equipment. And if they can't do that, they can't move forward with the investments. So this has to be resolved. Now, on the U.S. side, we've seen President Trump make some suggestions that he understands this is something that's resolved. He apparently offered to allow anyone from the raid who wanted to stay. Only one person took them up on that offer. There's also been talk that Secretary Rubio and Secretary Cho agreed to have some kind of visa working system in place. I think they're going to have to get that done, whether it's have Congress pass the Partner with Korea Act, which goes all the way back to the Chorus FTA and visa promises then, or whether it's to take and set up some new type of system that the administration feels they have within their own authority. That's going to have to happen. I think the difficulty here is that if I had to place a priority for the Trump administration on investment and immigration, immigration is the number one priority, investment is number two. And so I think this is going to be a challenge for the Trump administration to balance is, if you want the investment, how do you still do immigration enforcement in a way that meets your political objectives of, removing most of the individuals who come to the United States and are here illegally, with getting the investment in and making sure that the companies have, this figured out. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for them, because politically, I think with the Trump base, given his pledges, the immigration is going to be the priority, not the manufacturing.
During my previous trips to Korea, and I'll be back there next week, proponents of an indigenous South Korean nuclear weapons program pointed out that the U.S. threat to South Korea has a greater impact on their views of the need for indigenous weapons than the North Korean threat. And by that I mean the doubts that the U.S. will live up to its commitments, that South Korea is on its own, therefore it needs nuclear weapons. But the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, once there's the Washington agreement, U.S. officials said it was like a switch had been, changed, in that the Yoon administration stopped talking about the need for an indigenous program. The president had made a couple comments hinting at that, but during the last year and a half or year and a half to whatever, of the Yoon administration, there was really no government push for a program. President Lee himself and the Democratic Party have been even less amenable to pushing for an indigenous program. The DP in the past was even against domestic nuclear power plants. I think it's changed. I think it's more amenable to maintaining the current ones, but perhaps not building new ones. So it's not in favor of civilian power plants, nuclear power plants, as to the degree PPP was. So I think there will be far less push by an E administration on indigenous nuclear weapons than had a PPP candidate won the recent election.
Thank you. This is really uncertain time, even after the successful summit between the two leaders. We don't know what's going on. Every day things are changing. So, but given the
Invite us back.
yeah, exactly. That's what I was gonna say. You two were a very good team, I realized, and then next time I'm gonna invite you both. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us today and then sharing your insightful comments. It's really, I think I learned a lot from both of you. So thank you, and then please join me thanking our speakers.